In the heart of the Old Testament, the book of Ezekiel delivers a powerful and sober message. The prophet spoke to a nation in crisis, a people carried away from their homeland. His words were not meant to comfort in a simple sense. They were a divine mirror, reflecting deep spiritual decay. Among his pronouncements, one verse stands out, sharp and relevant today. It is a solemn warning to the spiritual leaders of the time, the ones entrusted to guide the nation in God's ways. This verse is Ezekiel 22:26, a passage that cuts to the core of spiritual responsibility. This study will unpack the meaning of this single verse. We will explore its original context and understand why God charged the priests of Israel. Our journey won't stay in the past. We will draw out timeless principles. The goal: show how this warning speaks to leaders and believers now. It calls us to examine our hearts and our communities. Are we keeping God's sacred distinctions, or have they become blurred and indistinct? The central theme of Ezekiel 22:26 is a failure of distinction. It is about losing the ability to tell the difference between what is holy and what is common. This is not a small matter. For ancient Israel and for us, this distinction shapes understanding of God's character and His will for His people. When the lines between sacred and the profane are erased, the very foundation of true worship begins to crumble. The warning is stark. This neglect does not go unnoticed by God, and it brings severe consequences for the whole community, not just leaders. We'll keep a tone of reverence and thoughtful reflection. This is not just academic. We're handling sacred words for spiritual growth. We will read the verse itself, then delve into its historical setting, examine what no distinction means, look at the specific charge about the Sabbath, and finally consider consequences and practical applications for today, creating a comprehensive, spiritually enriching study. Our journey into Ezekiel 22:26 will follow a clear and structured path. We will begin by simply reading the verse aloud. Allow its weight and gravity to settle upon us. The words themselves are a divine indictment. Hearing them plainly is the necessary first step. After reading, we will step back in time to the historical background. A verse without context is like a ship without an anchor. See Ezekiel in his world, speaking to a people in exile. Understand why his message was urgent and aimed at the priesthood. Next, we focus on the core of God's complaint. Her priests have done violence to my law. They have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common. We will dissect that phrase. What does it mean for something to be holy? What is considered common or profane? We'll use scripture like Leviticus to build the picture. This is not about arbitrary rules. It's about protecting the essence of relationship with a holy God. From this failure, the text moves to a specific example: the Sabbath. The priests have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths. We'll explain the Sabbath as a covenant sign. Drawing from Exodus 31:13, it's more than rest. A weekly reminder of God's creative power and His sanctifying presence. To neglect the Sabbath is to forget who God is and who they were. Finally, we'll connect cause and effect of priestly failure. When spiritual leaders compromise, what happens to the community? Doctrinal confusion, moral decline. We'll bring this warning into the 21st century. What does this mean for pastors? What does this mean for elders? What does this mean for teachers? What does this mean for every believer today? Using resources like the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, we'll discuss practical applications, ensuring this message inspires faithful action in our spiritual walks. Let us begin by turning our attention to the sacred text itself. To understand the depth of this divine warning, we must first hear the words as they were given to the prophet. The passage comes from a chapter where God is laying out a case against the entire nation of Judah, detailing the sins of its princes, priests, prophets, people. In the midst of this solemn catalog of transgressions, we find the specific indictment against the spiritual leaders. Let us now read Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 26. The Word of God says, "Her priests have done violence to my law and have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common, neither have they taught the difference between the unclean and the clean, and they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them." These are heavy words, filled with divine sorrow and judgment. They are not a gentle suggestion, but a direct accusation of profound failure. The priests, set apart to be the guardians of God's law and the teachers of His ways, are charged with actively violating that very law. Done violence to my law suggests a forceful and deliberate disregard for God's instructions. Not a simple oversight, but a sustained pattern of defiance. They twisted and broke the law, treating God's covenant with contempt. This charge sets a somber tone for our study. They have profaned my holy things. To profane is to treat the sacred as ordinary or contemptible. It strips away what was set apart. God had designated certain places, objects, times, and rituals as holy, dedicated exclusively to Him. The priests were the stewards of these holy things. Their failure contaminated the sacred space where people connect with God. This was a public act that corrupted the nation's spiritual life. At the heart of it, they made no distinction between the holy and the common. A loss of discernment and of teaching, a catastrophic breakdown in leadership. This single failure led to a cascade of other sins, including neglect of the Sabbath, ultimately profaning God among His people. To fully appreciate the gravity of Ezekiel's message, we must place ourselves in his historical setting. Ezekiel was not a prophet speaking to a prosperous nation in a time of peace. He was a priest called by God to be a prophet living as an exile in Babylon. He was among the first wave of captives taken from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar around 597 BC. His ministry unfolded far from the familiar sights of the temple and the holy city among a displaced, demoralized people. They were wrestling with a profound theological crisis. How could God's chosen people in the Promised Land suffer such a catastrophic defeat and deportation? The people in exile were tempted to blame everyone but themselves. Some believed God had been overpowered by the gods of Babylon. Others felt God had abandoned them unfairly. Ezekiel's mission was to confront these false narratives head-on. His task was to show their suffering was not God's weakness or injustice, but the direct consequence of their persistent sin and rebellion. He was God's prosecuting attorney, laying out the evidence for why covenant curses had finally come to pass. His words were harsh because the situation was desperate. The corruption Ezekiel condemned was not recent. It was the culmination of generations of spiritual decay. The leaders of Judah, the kings, the princes, the priests, had led the nation into idolatry and social injustice. The book of 2 Kings and Jeremiah paint a grim picture of child sacrifice, political corruption, worship of foreign gods. The very temple in Jerusalem, the dwelling place of God's name, had been defiled with pagan idols. The spiritual leadership had become utterly compromised, more interested in personal gain and political power. Ezekiel's prophetic style was as dramatic as his message. He performed symbolic acts. He told allegories. He recounted vivid, often terrifying visions. He lay on his side for over a year to symbolize Israel's and Judah's sin. He shaved his head, he shaved his beard, to illustrate the coming destruction of Jerusalem. These were not acts seeking popularity. They were desperate measures to break through spiritual deafness. His words in Ezekiel 22 are part of a larger effort to force the exiles to confront the truth, starting with the failures of those who were supposed to lead them. His focus on the priests is particularly sharp and significant. Why were they singled out with such specific charges? The answer lies in their unique role and sacred responsibility within the covenant community of Israel. They were descendants of Aaron, from the tribe of Levi, and they were set apart by God to minister in His holy sanctuary. Their duties were not just ceremonial, They were the primary teachers and guardians of God's law, the Torah. They were entrusted with the spiritual health and moral compass of the entire nation, making their failure especially devastating. The foundational text for their teaching role is found in Leviticus 10 through 11, given right after the unauthorized fire offering of Nadab and Abihu. God commands Aaron and his sons that they must distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. This was their core job description. They were to be the living boundary markers between the sacred and the profane, not only in their own conduct but also through their instruction of the people. When Ezekiel accuses them of failing to make this distinction, he is charging them with abandoning their most fundamental God-given duty. Furthermore, the priests were responsible for officiating the entire sacrificial system. This system was the primary means by which an individual or the community could receive atonement for sin and be restored to a right relationship with God. Every ritual, every offering, every festival was imbued with deep theological meaning, pointing to God's holiness and His provision for human sinfulness. For the priest to profane these holy things, as Ezekiel charges, was to corrupt the very means of grace God had provided. It would be like a modern doctor intentionally contaminating medicine, turning a source of healing into a source of sickness and death. Therefore, when the priests failed, the entire system was compromised. Their violence to the law was not a private matter. It had public and catastrophic consequences. If the teachers of holiness were themselves unholy, how could the people be expected to live holy lives? If the guardians of worship were themselves profaning it, how could the people offer true worship? Ezekiel's focus on the priests was not unfair. It was a recognition that the spiritual sickness of the nation began with its spiritual physicians. Their failure created a vacuum of truth and righteousness, which was quickly filled by the social and moral chaos that led to their national ruin. Gap 4s. As we bring this study to a close, we return to the central burden of Ezekiel 22 verse 26. God's concern was never merely about broken rituals or neglected customs. It was about the loss of reverence. When the priests failed to distinguish between the holy and the common, they did more than confuse theology. They misrepresented God Himself. The tragedy of Ezekiel's day was not simply that the nation sinned, but that those entrusted to teach truth no longer upheld it. The result was a community that lost its spiritual bearings. This warning speaks powerfully to our time. Whenever God's standards are softened, whenever sacred truths are treated casually, the same pattern unfolds. Confusion replaces clarity. Reverence gives way to convenience. And faith becomes hollow rather than transformative. Yet even in judgment, God's purpose is restoration. By exposing the failure of the priests, He was calling His people back to truth, holiness, and covenant faithfulness. Ezekiel 22 verse 26 is not only a warning to ancient Israel, it is an invitation to every generation, an invitation to recover discernment, to honor what God calls holy, to teach truth clearly, live it faithfully, and guard it reverently. May we be among those who restore the distinction between the sacred and the common. And in doing so, may God no longer be profaned among His people, but honored, obeyed, and revealed to the world.